Hi guys and welcome back. Today I'm working in acrylic and I mentioned that last week and I actually followed through with it, so I'm pretty excited that I'm able to work on something that's completely different from what I usually do. So if you aren't aware, I usually prefer to work in watercolor. That is my go-to choice for when I'm working traditionally. And I find that a lot of times we'll get into a rut pretty easily as far as when I'm doing the same technique and the same medium over and over again. And I need to get myself out of that every once in a while so that I can get back into finding new ways to do stuff, even when it's with that same medium that I prefer. So I decided that today I wanted to do acrylic. I have a ton of acrylics left over from school where I had to buy tons of them from different assignments, but overall I actually have very, very little experience with acrylics at all. Mostly what I did with the acrylics in school was things like little color comps so we could figure out how to mix colors, how to think about color, and when it came down to it, I didn't do a lot of like finished pieces in acrylic. I think I did a couple, but overall, yeah, I'm definitely a novice when it comes to acrylics. So if any of you guys have any good advice for me or for anyone else who's starting off in acrylic, I would love to hear it. But going into this one, I knew that I didn't really want to mix too much water in it because I know that you can mix so much that it can break down the composition of the acrylic paint. And I'm not sure what that point is yet, so I decided to steer clear of it altogether. So I did just use acrylic, and I actually do have this blending medium that I used when I was wanting it to be a lot thinner. That way I could create more of a glaze or something that I could get in there and really blend two of the colors together. But overall, I will definitely say when I worked on this piece, I felt very much out of my comfort zone, and I liked that. I'll put that out there. It was a very positive thing for me because I would think through, well, what should I do now? And I was just totally, I had no idea. I had no idea how to go about it. I did try to do things step by step. I tried to create base layers and then let those dry and then create layers on top of that, very similarly to how I work in watercolor, where I'd do one step then build on top of it with layer after layer. And it mostly worked. I think I know that the interesting thing about acrylics, which is actually pretty similar to watercolors in a lot of ways, is that some of the pigments behave very differently than others. So some of the colors that I wanted to mix, and I wanted to have this really opaque, powerful, strong color that immediately covered it up, they're actually very translucent colors, like the alizarin crimson that I was using at the very beginning. So it's just interesting to see that there are a lot of things that follow through with the way that I know how to work, and there's also some things that are very, very different. And it's just interesting that different types of paint have different qualities to them. And if you're curious, if you're just starting off, pretty much all types of paint, if you look at the back, they'll have some metrics as far as how that paint will behave, whether you're using acrylic or watercolor, and probably oil, though I don't have any experience with that. But you can look at the back and it'll give you a light fastness rating and an opacity rating, that is. So for these acrylics, I was looking at mine a lot to see which ones were opaque and which ones were transparent, and I was beginning to use that to my advantage. There were some areas, especially in her skin, where I started building up this pinky hue around like her fingertips. I was going in with this alizarin crimson because it's a very transparent color. That way I could sheer it out a little bit more and blend it into her skin. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself right here. I'm just barely getting to the hair. And I think that's the thing that I felt the most out of, well, not the hair. The thing that I felt the most out of practice and out of my element was thinking through the colors. With watercolor, I am very familiar with each of my paints and how they interact with each other and how I can layer them. With acrylics, I didn't have a very clear concept of how I wanted the colors to come together and how I would get to that final result. So I'm used to having a very strong idea of what I'm going to be able to paint, and then I have to have that idea from the very beginning with watercolors because you can see everything. It's pretty transparent. And with acrylics, you have a lot more of an option to cover things up. So I think that let me loosen up my ideas of what I wanted to jump into at the very beginning. And in some ways, I think that's good. And in other ways, I think that's bad. I think that it was really fun for me to be able to work in a way that I could work more spur in the moment and I can cover things up, and I didn't have to have everything exactly plotted out from the very beginning, which is very different from what I'm used to. And I actually had a lot of fun with that. Being able to add strands of hair later on and cover other colors up, I felt very freed from this very restrictive way of thinking about it. So that was really actually a very nice change of pace. But I would say the negative of that is that I went into this without a strong idea of the overall look at all. I had no idea, honestly, of the colors. I sort of played around with the paints and I wasn't really happy with what I was mixing together. And then I decided, well, I'm just going to jump in and do it, which normally would not fly. And I don't really recommend that even for myself, because I definitely get the best pictures when I have an idea at the beginning what it's going to look like. But it was a good tool for me to be able to, like I mentioned at the beginning, break out of the way that I normally work. Because I was doing something so different and I was able to think through it in a very different way, I know that when I go back to watercolor, it's going to change the way that I'm thinking about it and the way that I approach it. And that's really what I'm hoping for when I try out different tools like this and different mediums, is I'm hoping that it will freshen the way that I think about my process. And that way I can bring that knowledge and that openness into other things that I feel a lot more comfortable with. And today I'm using a pre-gessoed panel, artist panel that is. So it's just very, very smooth. And I like the concept of that. The few times that I've done acrylic before where I've used like the canvas panels, so they have that texture to them, I hated that texture. I really didn't like that it affected the overall look of it, but I can definitely see the benefits of that texture where it would like grip the paint. With this board, it had a very slippery quality to it. So all the paint that I put on there, it really just moved around and I could see these brush strokes where it was areas I didn't want brush strokes. And again, this is all just learning curve. This is stuff that I will learn as I practice and as I use it. It's just all these things that I don't necessarily think about when I'm first thinking about this project. And then when I get into it, it's interesting. It's interesting to see how different tools interact with different other tools. But yeah, I do feel like the smoothness of this board definitely affected the way that the final result looked, rather than me being able to control every element of it. And I think that's the thing that I had the hardest part with this piece, is simply that I didn't feel in control of the medium. So a lot of the things, it was like, oh, well, that kind of turned out kind of cool and I kind of like it, but I definitely didn't choose that. Like her skin, actually. I actually really like how it ends up looking, but in the spur of the moment, it was really pulling away from me, where it had a lot of these like little brush strokes. You can see those brush strokes in the paint. And it was not something that I necessarily was thinking about. And there are some areas where I did want those brush strokes, but I also wanted areas like maybe on her forehead to be a little bit smoother. So I think that that's definitely one of those things where just the more practice you put into a medium, the better you'll be at controlling it. And that way you can get the look that you want rather than having the medium control you. And that's just a good testament to practice and learning what you're using. And the final step is the step that I usually have for my traditional pieces, where I add a little bit of something shiny. And today I'm using both an interference paint, I think that's what it's called. I will have a link to all the paints that I'm using and all the tools and everything down below. So if you're curious, it'll be all down there. But I did have this really gorgeous paint that, depending on what color it's on top of and the way that the light is hitting it, it changes how it shines, and it has this really iridescent blue quality to it. So I love that. I use that on her hair, and then I use some gold paint for these branches behind her head. And for that final gold embellishment, I would have rather gone in and mixed some white into it so that it would have a lighter value than the background, since right now they're actually very close in value, so it does get lost a little bit, but that's okay. Overall, it still has that pop of shine that I wanted. And that's it for today. I absolutely loved working on something that was more painterly and less dependent on having an exact line work from the very beginning like I normally work. So this was really fun, actually, and I know that I want to do more like this. But yeah, as usual, I have the original available, so if you'd like to own this little painting, She is available at my shop, and I'll have a link down in the description with all of the tools that I used today, and I'll have a link in the end card as well. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys at my next video.